In our math today, we're going to take a pre-test. So you will click on Activities, Assign to Class folder, blue Math. You will see our first task is called Pre-test, Data and Graphs. Remember, we have not learned this stuff yet this year together, but you might know something from first or second grade. And I want you to show me on this task anything that you know about data and graphs from first and second grade. Remember, if there's a problem or question you don't know, that's okay. I don't want anyone feeling sad or feeling like they're not good at math because we haven't learned this yet. I only want you to show me what you do know about data and graphs. Please open your task by clicking Add Response and look at slide number 1. Slide number 1 gives you a graph and questions about the graph. I want you to use the graph to answer these questions. If you don't know something, you can put a question mark or leave it blank. If you do know something, I want you to show me and write it on the blank. Slide number 2 is also part of the pre-test. It says to use the frequency table to create a pictograph using a scale. You're going to use this data to create a graph over here. Show me anything you know from first and second grade. If you don't know something, that's okay. Now I know how to teach you. You have 10 minutes to do this pre-test. If you are done before 10 minutes, you can wait on Prodigy while we get ready to start our lesson. Show me what you know from first and second grade. Your time begins now. Now that we are done with our pre-test, we are going to start our lesson for today. Our lesson for today is all about graphs and data. So we have been practicing fractions so far, but now it's time for us to start a new assignment. On Seesaw, please go to Activities, Assign to Class folder, blue Math folder, and our lesson for today is called Data and Graphs Introduction. Go ahead and open our task together. And you need to wait on slide number 1. You should only be listening to directions from the teacher. You are not working ahead. You are participating with the lesson. We're going to begin today by listening to our success criteria and learning a bit about why we collect data and what is data. Students are focusing their attention, ready for listening.
We're beginning to data and graphs. Today we're going to be working at level 2 as we understand analyzing graphs. Today you're going to be talking about why we organize data and information. You might be having a birthday party and you might be wanting to know your friend's favorite type of candy. You can collect information by asking your friends what their favorite type of candy is. Then you might organize the information, which is what we call data. When you collect data, you can show that information and data by creating a graph. Today, we're going to look at types of graphs and make sure we understand some of the important parts of each graph.
So we have just heard a little bit about what our learning target is today. We know that information is called data. We heard an example that was all about if you're having a party and you want to figure out your friend's favorite type of candy, you might ask them that question, what is your favorite type of candy? You would collect the information and then you could call it data. Today, we're going to look at different types of graphs and the special parts of each graph. Our next job is going to be listening to a vocabulary that helps us learn more about what is data.
Yeah, y'all. A lot of people talking about data. Yeah. Data. Let's get into it, y'all. Okay, let me kick off this conversation. What's data? Well, that is information, numbers, and facts telling you about something. Yeah. And there's a lot of different types, so let's jump in. Let's go. Data could be the number of kids who go to your school and what their shoe size is. Or it could be info about a thing like a book. What does it smell like, feel like, or how does it look? Okay. These are called an object's property. What you need to know to understand what it is properly. We can use data to get answers, like how many kids in your class are good dancers, or how do students feel about the new playground. There are two types of data, let's break it down. There's qualitative data, and that refers to an object's qualities recorded in words, and quantitative data that's measured in numbers, like something's height, weight, age, or temperature. Now when you're gathering or collecting data, then you're taking measurements and notes and making observations. And some data you can collect on your own. For example, that plant that you're growing in your home, if you want to know how much it grows each week, take a ruler and measure it, record and repeat. That's data. Yeah, the facts and the numbers telling you about something so you can understand what it is. We use data to learn and answer questions about the world as it turns. That's data. Data, 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 data. That's data. Data, 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 data. Whoa. Okay, so you want to find out information about a group, like all the students in the 3rd grade. All you gotta do is ask them a bunch of questions, and then you got yourself a survey. Ask questions that apply to the whole population. Every single 3rd grader in this situation. Say you want to know the average 3rd grader's height, but you can't ask them all, that would take all night. Take a random sample of 3rd grade kids. Random means they have an equal chance of being picked, which means the sample represents 3rd graders as a whole. And the larger the sample size, the more accurate the result. Now, once all your information has been collected, and you have all the answers to your questions, you have a data set. It has everything you need. With so many measurements, it can be hard to read, so we need to analyze it, present it in ways that demonstrate answers to any questions raised. You can organize your data with a graph or a chart. It displays different kinds of data like art, line plots, pie charts, and bar graphs are 3 ways to organize the data that you have. Make sure they have titles. And what else? Let's see. The X and Y axes must be labeled correctly. Make sure that you display the data in a way that tells the right story and what you're trying to say. You don't want to make a graph that makes all the kids laugh. When you're using data, you gotta do the math. That's data. Yeah, the facts and the numbers telling you about something so you can understand what it is. We use data to learn and answer questions about the world as it turns. That's data. Data, 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 data. That's data. Data, 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 data. Whoa.
Doctor's cup, please. All right, so we have learned a little bit more about this information. Some people call it data, some people call it data, but it's the same thing. Data and data is the information that you're collecting. How we show it is using a graph. Our next video is going to talk about the parts of a graph. When we make a graph to show data, there are some really important things that we need to have. Our next video is going to teach us about that. You are focusing your eyes, your ears, and your brain to learn about the parts that a graph must have.
There are three main parts of a graph that we're going to talk about in third grade. The first one is the title. I'm going to circle title in red. The title tells us what type of information or data will be displayed in the graph. The next part of the graph is called categories. Categories can describe very specific types of data. So this graph is describing types of music, but the categories show us that we're going to be counting students and what are students' favorite types of music. Categories also refer to how the data is organized by type. So in this example, some categories of favorite types of music are hip hop, classical, rock, and jazz. The third part of a graph that's really important that we will talk more about in our next video is called the scale. The scale is looking at the numbers on a graph. The scale helps us read a graph and analyze the data. Without the scale, you don't really know much about the data being shown. In our next video, we're going to talk about what you learned in second grade and how we're going to use the scale with different types of graphs in third grade.
When we collect data and show it on a graph, you have to have a title, some categories so we know the type of information you are collecting, and the scale. Our next video is going to talk more about what you learned in second grade and what we're going to learn in third grade. Students are still focusing their attention, ready to learn.
We are learning about understanding graphs and being able to read a graph and analyze the data. We're going to talk about some types of graphs and why we use graphs. We know that data is information. When somebody collects a lot of information, one of the best ways to display that information or data is by creating a graph. In second grade, you used graphs like this. Notice that each smiley face is equal to one graph. I can read this graph because I know the scale. I can count by one and understand the graph. I know that 2 people voted for grapes as their favorite fruit. In third grade, we will study graphs that sometimes have a scale of 1, like this. Sometimes we will have a scale that is not 1.
What this video is explaining is that you are used to reading graphs that count by 1. Look at this example where they have collected data on favorite fruits. I see the categories are apples, pears, grapes, and bananas. I noticed the title is called Favorite Fruit. The scale tells me that each smiley face is equal to 1 vote. So I can count by ones to read the graph. In the video, I said that the grapes show me that 2 students voted for grapes. Who can read this graph counting by ones and understand how many votes banana earned? How many people voted for banana as their favorite fruit? I already see some hands raised. Excellent 3rd grade expectations. Gloria. There are 6 smiley faces next to banana. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So we know that 6 people voted for banana. That is a 2nd grade skill. Today we're going to talk about graphs that have a scale that's different than 1. Most of the time in 3rd grade, we will not count by ones when we read a graph. Let's keep going with our video to help us understand what that looks like in 3rd grade.
And we will use skip counting. Scale is how the data is organized and tells us how to count to read the graph. Let's look at some examples together. This is called a frequency chart. Some people call it a tally graph. This data is collected by making a tally mark. I'm going to try to figure out the scale of this graph by looking at the tallies and the frequency, or how often something happens. In this graph, we're talking about ways to travel. I noticed 3 tally marks by the bike. The frequency says 3. That tells me that each tally mark is equal to 1. The scale for this chart is 1.
A frequency chart is an example of a graph you should be familiar with, and we're going to use it in 3rd grade. This is a great way for us to collect information. In our vocabulary, we talked about having a survey. I bet you guys have some experience with asking questions and collecting information. Remember our example from this morning. If you are going to have a party and you want to know your friends' favorite types of candy, you might have to ask some questions. You might need to create a survey and collect information about your friends and the types of candy they enjoy. After you create some questions and ask them, you could use something like this to collect the information. People put a tally mark to collect the information as they learn about the questions. Let's keep going. We're going to learn about more graphs that we will use in 3rd grade.
Remember, in 3rd grade, we will be looking at examples where the scale is not 1, and we have to skip count in order to read the graph correctly. This is called a line plot. Notice it looks like a number line, and we are plotting little X's. I notice this one does have a scale that is different than 1. At the bottom, sometimes a graph will have a key, and they will tell you what the scale is. In this line plot, each X is equal to 2. So if I'm going to look at the length of the shoe, I see that there are 2 people that have the length of 6, and there are 4 people that have the length of 8, because each x is 2. A line plot is one example of a graph that we will be using in 3rd grade. Let's take a look at another graph that we will be using that also uses scales different than 1. This is called a bar graph. A bar graph is an easy way to represent data and use a scale different than 1. I notice the numbers on this bar graph are not counting by 1 because it goes from 0 to 5. The scale on this bar graph is 5. We have to skip count by 5 in order to read the data. A pictograph is a graph you should be familiar with from 2nd grade. You might hear the word picture in the graph name. A pictograph is another easy way to show data by drawing a picture. I notice the scale of this graph is counting by 10s and counting by 5s. Today we will practice exploring these types of graphs and identifying the title and scale and the categories on each graph.
We have just seen some different types of graphs that we will use in 3rd grade. Make sure you are on Seesaw looking at slide number 1 with me. We are going to work together to do a couple examples before you start your independent task. Our task is on the left. It gives us some jobs to do. It says identify the title, the categories, and type of graph and scale. So let's look at the graph given on slide number 1. First, let's start with the type of graph. Is this a bar graph, a line plot, a pictograph, or a frequency chart? This one is called a line plot. So I'm going to circle the type of graph to show that I can identify what type of graph this is. Notice it has the name line in it because it has a number line shown. We have just identified the type of graph. Let's look next for the title. On a graph, there will always be a title that helps us know what type of information we are collecting. The title says hours of exercise. So the data or information in this graph is all about how many hours people are exercising. We have just identified the title together. Next, we're looking for the categories. On a line plot, the categories are a little bit tricky. I see that there are some numbers on the tick marks, starting at 0 hours of exercise, 1/4 of an hour of exercise, 1/2 of an hour of exercise, 3/4, and 1 whole hour of exercise. By circling, I have shown these are the categories of data. Our task says to identify the type of graph. We already did that over here by circling line plot. And finally, we need to identify the scale. Remember, the scale tells us what we are counting by to read the graph. Check out the key on the graph. It says 1x equals 1 person. I have now identified the scale on the graph, and I'm going to record it over here by filling in the blank. This graph has a scale that counts by 1. Some graphs count by 1 with their scale. Remember, in 3rd grade, we will start looking at graphs that do not count by 1. Their scale is greater than 1. Let's do number 2 together. Here is a different example of a graph. We're going to do those same things. We're going to identify the title, the categories of data, the type of graph it's showing, and the scale. I want you to start with title. Circle the title on this graph. You should have circled the words at the top. This one says favorite musical instrument. The title tells me what type of information we're talking about in the graph. Now let's do the categories. If our graph is talking about favorite musical instruments, what kind of categories do we have on our graph? I'll give you a hint. I see 3 categories. Who can identify some of the categories we see on this graph? We know we're talking about musical instruments, but what kind? Angela, what's one?
One kind is a guitar.
Okay, so some kind of guitar. I see one category. It's a stringed instrument. Might be a guitar. It might be a violin or viola. Thank you, Angela. There are 2 more categories. We know we're talking about favorite musical instruments. So what kind? Categories help us. Gloria.
It looks like an electric piano.
Electric piano. Circle your next category. Honesty, what is the 3rd category you can identify?
Piano, wait, a drum?
Yeah, we already did piano. Thank you, a drum. So our title tells us what type of information. Our categories give us even more information. Now we know that we're talking about favorite instruments like the piano, like the drum, like the guitar or violin. Awesome, we've just identified the categories. Next, let's do the type of graph. Remember to look to the right. What type of graph is this? Is this a line plot, a bar graph, a pictograph, or a frequency chart? This is called a pictograph. Notice the word picture. Sounds like picture because we draw pictures to represent the data. We have now identified the type of graph. Awesome. Our last job is to identify the scale. Look on the graph. Do you see a key? Do you see a scale that helps us know what we're counting by?
Nope.
I do. I see at the bottom, it even says scale. Our scale tells us that each smiley face is equal to 5 children. So on the right, I can record the scale for this example counts by 5. In order to read this graph, you have to count by 5s. So for example, how many children chose the drum as their favorite instrument? We can count by 5s to figure that out. 5 students said drums, 5 more students said drums. Altogether, 10 students said the drum is their favorite instrument. Your job today is to continue identifying the parts of each graph. When you start your independent work, slide number 3 is an example for you to watch and review with me. When you start your task, you will watch number 3 to review how to do this. Then you have 5 graphs to practice on identifying the important parts of a graph. On slide number 8, you will reflect on your success today. Were you able to understand our important vocabulary and the parts of a graph? It is now time for us to end our Zoom.